Montana Territory, 1876. Rugged hills stretched out beyond the dusty main street of Willow Creek, a town barely clinging to existence on the frontier's edge. Roy Quincy shifted uncomfortably on the rickety chair outside the general store, his 25-year-old frame too restless for sitting. The late afternoon sun caught in his sandy brown hair as he watched the stagecoach approach, kicking up clouds of prairie dust. "That'll be the Ellison mail-order bride," old Sam Tucker called out, sweeping the boardwalk beside his barber shop. "Poor Matthew's been waiting half a year." Roy nodded absently, adjusting his well-worn Stetson. A man who tied himself to one place was asking for trouble out here. The frontier demanded movement, demanded caution. Love was a luxury that got men killed when winter came or the crops failed. Better to work the cattle drives, move with the seasons, and keep your heart unattached. That's what 6 years of ranch work had taught him since he'd ridden away from his family's failed homestead at 19. He'd come to Willow Creek only because Thornton Ranch offered steady winter work. Come spring, he'd move on again. Always moving, never settling. It was the only way to survive the heartbreak the frontier inevitably delivered. The stagecoach rattled to a stop, and Roy watched with mild curiosity as Matthew Ellison, the town's young blacksmith, rushed forward. The coach door swung open, and a woman stepped down, tall, blonde, prim in a traveling dress the color of faded cornflowers. Matthew's face fell slightly before he recovered his smile. Then a second woman emerged. Roy felt the world around him slow to a halt as she stepped into the light. 20 years old at most, with chestnut hair tumbling in waves beneath a modest bonnet. Her emerald green traveling dress had seen better days, but she wore it with a grace that made the worn fabric seem inconsequential. Her face, lightly freckled across a delicate nose, held both strength and vulnerability, a contradiction that seized Roy's attention completely. Matthew Ellison's face reflected confusion as he looked between the two women. "Matthew Ellison?" the blonde woman asked, extending a gloved hand. "I'm Olivia Gordon. My letter mentioned I might be accompanied by my younger sister, Opal." The second woman, Opal, gave a small curtsy, her green eyes quickly scanning the gathered townfolk before settling, just for a moment, on Roy. Something electric passed between them, a recognition he couldn't explain. Roy stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. This was trouble. This was exactly the kind of complication a man who valued freedom didn't need. 2 weeks later, Roy was still in Willow Creek. He told himself it was the decent wages at Thornton Ranch keeping him there, not the chance encounters with Opal Gordon in town. Matthew and Olivia's wedding was set for June, barely a month away. The town buzzed with excitement. A new marriage meant hope for the future, another family putting down roots. Roy kept his distance from such sentiments, even as he found himself lingering in town after his errands were complete. It was on such an afternoon that fate intervened. Dark clouds gathered with sudden menace over the mountains. Roy was securing supplies in the back of the ranch wagon when a deluge broke loose. Through the sheets of rain, he spotted Opal struggling with packages outside the mercantile, her thin shawl no match for the storm. "Miss Gordon," he called, abandoning his own preparations to rush to her side. "Let me help you with those." Her drenched bonnet clung to her hair, raindrops catching on her eyelashes as she looked up at him. "Mr. Quincy, I'm afraid the weather caught me by surprise." "It does that out here," he said, taking her parcels. "My wagon's just there. May I offer you shelter until this passes?" The closeness of the wagon's covered bed, the scent of wet cotton and leather, the sound of rain drumming overhead. It created an unexpected intimacy as they sat side by side. "How are you finding Willow Creek?" Roy asked, aware of every inch of space between them. Opal's smile held a shadow. "It's beautiful country, different from Pennsylvania in every way imaginable. You didn't want to come west?" "I had little choice." Something in her voice made Roy turn to study her profile. "Our parents died last winter. Influenza." Olivia had already been corresponding with Mr. Ellison. When she decided to accept his proposal, "I couldn't stay behind alone." The admission hung between them. Roy recognized in her words his own experience of having choices stripped away by circumstance. "The frontier isn't kind to those who stand alone," he said softly. Opal met his gaze directly. "Is that why you keep to yourself, Mr. Quincy? I've noticed you don't join the others for Sunday socials." The observation startled him. "I'm just passing through, Miss Gordon." Come spring, I'll be moving on. Always moving on, she said, not as a question, but as if seeing through him. Is there nowhere you consider home? The question struck deeper than she could know. Home is a dangerous idea out here. Better to stay light on your feet. Thunder cracked overhead, making Opal jump. Without thinking, Roy placed his hand over hers. The contact lasted only a moment before propriety reasserted itself, but in that brief connection, something shifted between them. The storm passed, but the questions Opal had raised lingered in Roy's mind like distant thunder. As April turned to May, Roy found himself creating reasons to visit town. Sometimes he'd glimpse Opal helping at the schoolhouse where she'd begun assisting the teacher, or walking with her sister as they prepared for the upcoming wedding. One evening, returning from delivering cattle to a neighboring ranch, Roy came across Opal sitting alone by Silver Creek, sketching in a small book. He should have continued writing. Instead, he dismounted. "You're quite talented," he said, approaching slowly to avoid startling her. Opal closed the sketchbook quickly. "My mother taught me. She believed even practical skills should have beauty in them." "She sounds wise." Roy hesitated, then sat beside her on the grassy bank. "May I ask you something, Miss Gordon? Why did your sister choose to become a mail-order bride? It seems a risky proposition." Opal's gaze followed the creek's winding path. "Olivia has always been practical. After our parents died, she determined marriage was the surest path to security." She paused. "But I think she hopes for love too, in time." "And you? What do you hope for?" The question was too forward, and Roy regretted it immediately. But Opal didn't seem offended. "I hope to find purpose," she said simply. "And perhaps someday, someone who sees me, not as a responsibility or an obligation, but as myself." The honesty in her words cut through Roy's carefully constructed defenses. Before he could respond, shouts echoed from downstream. They both rose quickly, Roy's hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. Two boys from town had ventured too far into the spring-swollen creek. One was struggling against the current, panic evident in his flailing arms. Without hesitation, Roy plunged into the cold water. The current was stronger than he'd anticipated, the snowmelt from the mountains making the creek treacherous. He reached the boy just as the child's head dipped beneath the surface. With one arm wrapped securely around the boy's chest, Roy fought his way back to shore. Opal was there to help pull them onto the bank, quickly wrapping the shivering child in her shawl, while the second boy watched with wide, frightened eyes. "You saved him," Opal said, her voice filled with something like awe as she helped Roy to his feet. "You didn't even think. You just acted." Roy shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable with her admiration. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said firmly. "Not anyone. Not everyone has the courage to risk themselves for others." Her words stayed with him that night as he lay awake in the ranch bunkhouse, listening to the snores of the other hands. For the first time in years, Roy found himself imagining what it might be like to stay in one place, to build something lasting. The thought terrified him. As Matthew and Olivia's wedding approached, tension grew between the sisters. Roy observed it from a distance, seeing the strain in Opal's face when they crossed paths in town. "Olivia insists I should be seeking my own match," Opal confided one afternoon when they met outside the general store. "There's a widower with 2 young children who's shown interest. She thinks it would be convenient." Something fierce and protective flared in Roy's chest. "And what do you think?" "I think convenience is a poor foundation for a life together." Her eyes met his with an intensity that made his heart race. "I've seen what happens when people marry without affection. They may survive together, but they don't truly live." Before Roy could respond, Matthew Ellison approached, his expression troubled. "Opal, there you are? Olivia's asking for you. Something about final dress fittings." As Opal excused herself, Matthew lingered, waiting until she was out of earshot before turning to Roy. "I've seen how you look at her," he said without preamble. Roy stiffened. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm telling you that Olivia's concerned. She doesn't want Opal distracted from finding a suitable arrangement here." "Arrangement?" Roy couldn't keep the edge from his voice. "She's not cattle to be traded." "Of course not. But she's dependent on us now. Olivia feels responsible for securing her future. Maybe Opal should determine her own future." Matthew studied him for a long moment. "Olivia says you're leaving come summer anyway. If that's true, you'd do well to keep your distance. Opal deserves stability, not a man who'll disappear with the first north wind. The truth in Matthew's words stung like a lash. Roy had no right to complicate Opal's life when he had no intention of changing his ways. The frontier was no place for tender feelings. Hadn't his parents' failed homestead proved that? His father's broken spirit, his mother's early grave? For the next week, Roy avoided town entirely. The wedding was set for the third Saturday in June. Roy had resolved to be gone before then, had even spoken to the ranch foreman about collecting his wages early. But fate had other plans. 3 days before the wedding, word reached Thornton Ranch that a gang of outlaws had been spotted in the area. The very next morning, they struck, raiding the general store and shooting the sheriff when he attempted to intervene. Roy and 2 other ranch hands rode hard for town when they heard the shots. By the time they arrived, the outlaws were gone, but they'd taken hostages, Olivia and the storekeeper's wife. Matthew was beside himself with grief and rage. "They left this," he said, thrusting a crudely written note at Roy. The demand was simple: bring $500 to Eagle Canyon by sundown, or the women wouldn't return alive. "The whole town doesn't have that kind of cash," one of the townsmen despaired. Amid the chaos, Roy found Opal standing alone, her face pale but composed. "Are you all right?" he asked, breaking his own promise to keep his distance. "They came in while we were selecting ribbon for the wedding," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I was in the back room. If I'd been at the counter with Olivia—" "Don't think about that," Roy said firmly, taking her hands in his. "We're going to get her back." The men of Willow Creek formed a hasty posse, gathering what money and valuables they could. Roy joined them without hesitation, his knowledge of the territory making him an invaluable guide. As they prepared to ride out, Opal approached, now dressed in riding clothes. "I'm coming with you," she stated. "Absolutely not," Matthew objected. "It's too dangerous." "She's my sister," Opal countered. "And I know these men. I saw their faces, heard them talking. One of them, their leader, I think he recognized Olivia somehow. There's something more happening here." Roy stepped between them. "She's right about it being too dangerous," he said to Opal. "But she might also be right about knowing something important." He turned to Matthew. "We need every advantage. She comes with us to the canyon approach, stays back with one of the men while we handle the exchange." Eagle Canyon was a notorious hideout, its winding passages and high walls providing natural protection. As the posse approached at dusk, Roy held back with Opal while the others established positions. "There's something I need to tell you," Opal said quietly, her voice barely audible above the wind. "The leader of those men, I recognized him from a photograph Olivia kept. He's from our hometown. There were rumors that he and Olivia were once involved before he turned to outlawry." The revelation struck Roy like a physical blow. "You think this isn't just about money? I think it's about her. About taking her away." Opal's voice trembled. "If that's true, they won't let her go, no matter what we bring them." The exchange was set for the canyon floor, a space visible from multiple angles, but with limited cover. Roy studied the terrain, a plan forming. "Stay here," he told Opal firmly. "No matter what happens, stay with Ben until we return." The exchange went wrong almost immediately. The outlaw leader, a man called Fletcher, laughed when he saw the collection of money and valuables Matthew had brought. "This isn't even half what we asked for," he sneered, keeping Olivia close beside him. The storekeeper's wife was held by another outlaw several paces away. "It's all we have," Matthew pleaded. "Please, we're to be married in 3 days." Fletcher's laugh turned ugly. "Is that so? Well, Olivia and I have some history of our own, don't we, darling? Maybe she'd prefer to ride with a real man instead of playing house in this backwater." Roy, positioned on a ledge above with a rifle, saw the moment everything changed. Olivia, far from appearing frightened, straightened and moved closer to Fletcher. "I told you they wouldn't bring enough," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the canyon's acoustics. "I told you we should have just left." The betrayal hung in the air like gun smoke. Matthew staggered backward as if physically struck. "Olivia, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I made a mistake, Matthew. James and I, we have unfinished business." The revelation created just enough distraction. Roy signaled to the other men, and they opened fire, careful shots aimed above the outlaws' heads, driving them for cover. In the chaos, the storekeeper's wife broke free, running toward Matthew. But Olivia made no move to escape. Instead, She pulled a small pistol from her skirts and aimed it directly at Matthew. Everything happened at once. Another outlaw emerged from hiding, firing wildly. The posse returned fire. Matthew dove for cover, dragging the storekeeper's wife with him. And Roy, seeing Fletcher pulling Olivia toward the horses, took careful aim. His shot caught Fletcher in the shoulder, spinning him away from Olivia. But instead of running toward safety, she turned her pistol toward the sound of the shot, toward Roy's position. A flash of movement caught Roy's eye. Horror struck him as he realized Opal had disobeyed his order to stay back. She was running toward her sister, calling Olivia's name. Olivia hesitated, her gun hand wavering. In that moment of hesitation, Fletcher grabbed her again, using her as a shield as he retreated toward the horses. "Olivia, please," Opal cried. "This isn't you." But Olivia's face hardened as she looked at her younger sister. "You never understood, Opal. I was never meant for a life of compromise and sacrifice. James offers me freedom. He offers you outlawry and a noose." Opal countered. Fletcher, bleeding but mobile, suddenly shifted his aim toward Opal. Enough of this family reunion. Roy didn't remember moving. One moment he was on the ledge. The next he was throwing himself between Opal and Fletcher's gun. The shot came just as Roy collided with Opal, driving them both to the ground. Fire erupted in his side as the bullet found its mark. The world narrowed to the feeling of Opal beneath him, safe, and the spreading warmth of blood along his ribs. "Roy!" Opal's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Someone help. He's been shot." The last thing Roy saw before darkness claimed him was Olivia and Fletcher mounting horses and galloping away, leaving chaos in their wake. Roy woke to pain and the soft sound of humming. He opened his eyes to find himself in an unfamiliar room, sunlight streaming through lace curtains. Opal sat beside the bed, her fingers moving deftly as she stitched something in her lap. When she noticed he was awake, relief flooded her face. "Thank God," she whispered, setting aside her work to pour water from a pitcher. "The doctor wasn't sure when you'd wake up." Memory returned in fragments. The canyon, the betrayal, the gunshot. "Olivia?" he managed to ask. Sadness clouded Opal's eyes. "Gone." They rode south, toward the border. "The territorial marshal has been notified, but—" She shook her head. "Matthew is devastated. The whole town is in shock." Roy tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his side. Opal gently pressed him back onto the pillows. "The bullet broke a rib but missed anything vital," she explained. "You've been unconscious for 2 days. Dr. Willis says you need at least a month of rest before you can even think of traveling." A month. The thought should have filled Roy with restless dread. Instead, he felt an unexpected relief. "Where am I?" he asked, looking around the modest but comfortable room. "Mrs. Henderson's boarding house." She had an empty room, and Opal hesitated. "I've been helping with your care. It seemed the least I could do, after you saved my life." The following weeks passed in a strange, dreamlike state for Roy. Confined to bed at first, he had little to do but think about the life he'd been living, about the walls he'd built around himself, about the woman who had somehow slipped past his defenses. Opal came daily, bringing books, news from town, and a companionship Roy had never allowed himself to need before. They talked for hours, about her childhood in Pennsylvania, about his years drifting across the Western Territories, about dreams neither had voiced aloud before. "I never understood why Olivia was so determined to marry a stranger," Opal confessed one evening as sunset painted the room in gold. "Now I wonder if she was planning this all along, using Matthew and Willow Creek as a way to reunite with Fletcher." "Does it change how you see her?" Roy asked carefully. Opal considered the question. "I'm angry, hurt, but mostly, I feel sorry for her. She's choosing a life that can only end in sorrow." "And what about you? What life would you choose if you could have anything?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Opal's gaze met his, unwavering. "I would choose a life with purpose, with beauty, even in difficult times, with someone who sees the world clearly but chooses hope anyway." Her voice softened. "I would choose a life with someone brave enough to stay, even when staying is harder than running." The words penetrated the last of Roy's defenses. In that moment, he recognized the truth he'd been fighting since the day Opal Gordon stepped off the stagecoach. The frontier didn't have to mean isolation. Perhaps the real courage wasn't in facing danger alone, but in risking your heart in a harsh land. As Roy recovered his strength, he and Opal began taking short walks through town. He noticed how she'd found her place in Willow Creek, teaching at the school, organizing a small library corner in the general store, bringing together the women of the town to help a new widow. "You belong here," he said one afternoon as they rested on a bench outside the church. "I'm making a place for myself," she corrected gently. "There's a difference between accepting circumstance and choosing a home." The summer stretched on, hot and golden. Roy's wounds healed, and with them, something within him that had been broken much longer. He took odd jobs around town, postponing his departure again and again. When Thornton, his former employer, offered him a position as foreman with a small cabin of his own, Roy found himself accepting. For the first time since his family's homestead failed, he was putting down roots. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a quiet certainty. It was Opal who finally confronted what was growing between them. On a crisp September evening, as they walked along Silver Creek where they had first truly spoken, she stopped and turned to face him. "You haven't left?" she said simply. "No," Roy agreed, his heart hammering. "I haven't. Are you going to?" Her voice was steady, but he could see the vulnerability in her eyes. Roy took her hands in his, feeling as though his entire life had been leading to this moment. "Not without you. Not ever without you. If you'll have me." Joy bloomed across her face like sunrise. "I thought perhaps you were staying out of obligation or pity for what happened with Olivia. I'm staying because for the first time in my life, leaving feels like the coward's choice." He brought her hands to his lips. "I'm staying because I love you, Opal Gordon. Because you showed me that the frontier doesn't have to be faced alone." Their wedding took place as autumn painted the hills in gold and crimson. The entire town turned out, rallying around the couple who had found love amid betrayal and violence. Opal wore a simple dress of deep blue, wildflowers in her chestnut hair. Roy stood tall and proud beside her, scarcely able to believe that this remarkable woman had chosen him. "I, Roy Quincy, take you, Opal Gordon, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he vowed, his voice clear and certain. "To face all seasons together, to build our home in each other, and to never again mistake solitude for safety or movement for freedom." Opal's answering vows brought tears to the eyes of even the most hardened ranchers. "I, Opal Gordon, take you, Roy Quincy, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to create beauty even in hardship, to find purpose in our shared life, and to be your home as you are mine, wherever the frontier may lead us." As winter descended on Willow Creek, Roy and Opal settled into the foreman's cabin at Thornton Ranch. They made it their own. Opal's sketches framed on walls, books stacked by the hearth, curtains softening the frontier pragmatism of the small home. Word reached them in December that Olivia and Fletcher had been captured in Colorado. Fletcher would hang for murder. Olivia faced years in prison as his accomplice. The news brought Opal grief, but also closure. "I used to think the frontier was cruel for taking our parents, for forcing us west," she confided as they lay together one night, snowfall softening the world outside. "Now I see it differently. The frontier doesn't take, it reveals. It shows us who we truly are when all pretenses are stripped away." Roy drew her closer, marveling at the wisdom of the woman who had transformed his life. "And who are we, Mrs. Quincy, when all is stripped away?" Opal smiled up at him, love and certainty in her green eyes. "We are people who choose to build rather than run, who face the wilderness together instead of alone." She placed his hand over her abdomen, where their child had just begun to grow. "We are a family, carving out a future in this wild, beautiful place." As spring returned to Montana territory, bringing new life to the land, Roy stood on the porch of their cabin and watched Opal tending the garden they'd planted together. Her chestnut hair caught the sunlight as she straightened, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her pregnancy. The man who had once believed love was a luxury the frontier couldn't afford now understood a deeper truth. Love wasn't a luxury at all, but the very foundation that made the hardships worthwhile. Not a weakness to be avoided, but the strength that had always been waiting for him to claim it. Opal looked up, catching his gaze, and smiled. A smile that promised home and belonging and a future built by 4 loving hands. Roy smiled back, his heart full with the certainty that everything had indeed changed, and it had changed for the better.